This is one of those somber days in the church calendar when we are required to confront the appalling consequences of human sin. This is particularly challenging for a generation such as ours that has enjoyed such an unparalleled period of peace and plenty. Yet history teaches us that we can be plunged into the horrors of war in the blinking of an eye. Consider the First World War that seemingly arose out of nothing very much. Jesus does not mince his words about this prospect. It is what we can expect. He speaks in today's Gospel of the temple in Jerusalem being destroyed, a prophecy that was realized in horrific fashion in AD 70 when the Romans put down a Jewish rebellion. And such was the slaughter and destruction, it must have seemed like the end of the world to those caught up in it. By contrast, later in the reading, he is anticipating the end of all things, the final apocalypse, and the wars, earthquakes, and famines that will precede it. These things are to be expected. It is, sadly, the way of things in a world gone wrong. As Christians, of course, we see this warning in the light of the whole story of the New Testament, that Jesus suffered horribly at the hands of the Romans, but then, in an almighty act of recreation, he was raised from the dead to a new and different life. Whatever the brutality and suffering of this present age, death and destruction do not have the final say. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is a God of the living, not the dead, and will put things right. Well, that's what we believe, or say we believe, when we say the Creed. But it's hard, isn't it? Especially when confronted with fresh horrors. I defy anyone watching or listening to John Simpson's report this week from Afghanistan to have done so without feeling a measure of despair. And yet, in the midst of this darkness, life does spring eternal. It does so when we encounter ordinary men and women behaving righteously. Now, I use that term righteously advisedly because in English it carries with it rather priggish connotations of moral perfection. Whereas in Hebrew, righteousness is a quality of one, especially and above all God, who puts right what has gone wrong. And I recently came across a wonderful example of an act of righteousness in awful circumstances. It's contained in a letter from Captain A.D. Chater to his mother from his trench during Christmas of 1914. And it goes like this. Dearest Mother, I'm writing this in the trenches in my dugout with a wood fire going and plenty of straw. It's rather cosy, although it is freezing hard, real Christmas weather. I think I've seen one of the most extraordinary sights today that anyone has ever seen. About 10 o'clock this morning, I was peeping over the parapet when I saw a German waving his arms, and presently two of them got out of their trenches and came towards ours. We were just going to fire on them when we saw that they had no rifles. So one of our men went out to meet them, and in about 2 minutes, the ground between the two lines of trenches was swarming with men and officers of both sides, shaking hands and wishing each other a happy Christmas. This continued for about half an hour when most of our men were ordered back to the trenches. For the rest of the day, nobody has fired a shot, and men have been wandering about at will on top of the parapet and carrying straw and firewood about in the open. We have also had joint burial parties, with a service for some of the dead, some German and some ours, who were lying out between the lines. Some of our officers were taking groups of British and German soldiers. This extraordinary truce has been quite impromptu. There was no previous arrangement, and of course it had been decided that there was not to be any cessation of hostilities. I went out myself and shook hands with several of their officers and men. From what I gathered, most of them would be as glad to get home again as we should. I don't know how long it will go on for. I believe it was supposed to stop yesterday, but we can hear no firing going on along the front today, except a little distant shelling. We are, at any rate, having another truce on New Year's Day, as the Germans want to see how the photos have come out. Well, that line about the photos really gets to me. The idea of these young men taking pictures of each other and holding another truce so that they can see how those pictures have come out. Of course, the truce didn't hold, and the machinery of war rumbled on for another 4 years, devouring and wrecking the lives of countless young men. But amidst all the carnage and hopelessness, here was an act of righteousness. An act of some brave young man working against orders to momentarily put right something that had gone horribly wrong. In today's reading from Daniel, we find this beautiful verse. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like stars forever and ever. If ever that verse was true, it was surely true of those young soldiers. May they rest in peace and rise in glory. Acts of righteousness occur when the actions of men and women match the very best of their imaginations. Every act of righteousness, however small, is an act of defiance against what the writer of Ephesians calls the principalities and powers that rule this world of ours. These acts are not futile, for they are an affirmation of life and all that makes for fullness of life. More than that, they affirm the truth revealed to us in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, that God is a God of righteousness, and that nothing on earth can separate any of us from his love, forgiveness, and redemption. Amen.